Most Bigfoot encounters are just stories passed from one person to another. But a small number were captured in real time, leaving behind footage that still sparks debate. These moments weren't staged or expected. They happened without warning. In this episode, we look at Bigfoot encounters that were actually caught on camera and why they continue to divide opinion. On June 4, 2024, a girl recorded Bigfoot having a horrifying conversation with her for multiple minutes. What was a normal day for her turned into concrete evidence that he can communicate with human beings. Never before was a fragment of the Sasquatch speaking this long, and what he told her changed what we know about Bigfoot forever. Documentary maker Maya Thornton had been recording for less than an hour when her equipment started registering sounds that didn't match any animal in her extensive audio database. The words she heard were distorted, formed by a vocal apparatus not designed for human language, but the intention was clear. Something was trying to talk to her, and it had been practicing. The first word was barely recognizable, a drawn-out sound that might have been you or who, followed by a long pause, as if the speaker was waiting for confirmation that Maya had understood. She remained motionless, her hand hovering over the record button that was already capturing everything, her mind racing through protocols she'd developed for this exact scenario, even though part of her had never truly believed it would happen. The voice came again, clearer this time, and Maya's audio software registered it as originating from approximately 40 feet away, hidden in the dense undergrowth where her cameras couldn't penetrate. The creature, and Maya's scientific training, insisted on that term even as her instinct screamed that this was something more, seemed to be choosing its words carefully, speaking with the deliberation of someone using a second language they'd learned through observation rather than instruction. What it said next would be debated by experts for its implications about consciousness and intelligence, but the meaning was unmistakable. It wanted to know why she had come, and whether she was finally ready to listen. Maya's response was instinctive, a whispered acknowledgement that yes, she could hear it. Yes, she was listening, words that felt inadequate for a moment, that was rewriting everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The creature's reaction was immediate, a sound that might have been satisfaction or relief, followed by movement that brought it closer to the clearing's edge. Still concealed, but nowhere near enough that Maya could hear its breathing, deep and measured, like someone preparing to deliver a rehearsed speech. Her cameras captured the vegetation moving, branches swaying without wind, and her audio equipment registered multiple sources now, suggesting that other creatures had moved into position around the clearing, forming an audience or perhaps a security perimeter for what was about to unfold. The primary voice spoke again, and this time the words came in a sequence that suggested not just communication, but storytelling. A narrative that had been waiting generations to be shared with someone who possessed both the technology to record it and the willingness to believe. The creature's account, delivered in halting English mixed with sounds that defied transcription, painted a picture of a species that had been observing human development for centuries, watching from the margins as civilization expanded into territories they'd occupied since before recorded history. It spoke of deliberate concealment, of a collective decision made long ago to remain hidden from a species that had proven itself dangerous to anything it didn't understand, and of the careful selection of individuals like Maya who might serve as bridges between worlds that had existed in parallel for too long. The voice described a society with its own language, its own history, its own understanding of the forest that predated human presence in North America. And it spoke with a sadness that transcended species about the shrinking territories and the growing difficulty of maintaining separation from a human population that was pushing into every remaining wild space. Most disturbing was its explanation for why it had chosen to break centuries of silence now. Because time was running out, and decisions needed to be made about whether continued hiding was possible or whether some form of controlled contact was inevitable. Maya's questions, whispered into her recording equipment, were met with responses that demonstrated the creature's sophisticated understanding of human society and technology. It knew about cameras, about the internet, about the way information spread through human networks, and it expressed concern about what would happen if proof of its species' existence became undeniable. The conversation touched on topics that seemed impossible for a forest-dwelling creature to comprehend: government responses, scientific study, the loss of autonomy that would come with discovery. And Maya realized with growing astonishment that she was speaking with an intelligence that had been studying humanity as carefully as humans studied wildlife, learning languages through eavesdropping on hikers and campers, understanding technology through observation of the equipment that researchers brought into the forest. The creature spoke of others like itself who had learned different human languages, who monitored radio communications and even accessed the internet through methods it didn't fully explain, painting a picture of a hidden civilization that was far more aware of the modern world than anyone had imagined possible. The conversation took a darker turn when Maya asked about the reports of aggressive encounters, the stories of hikers being chased or intimidated by massive figures in the forest. The creature's response carried what sounded like regret mixed with justification. It described a species under pressure, defending territories that were being encroached upon, sometimes using fear as a tool to drive humans away from areas that were considered sacred or essential to their survival. It spoke of younger members of its kind who were less patient with the policy of concealment, who wanted to confront the human expansion more directly, and of growing tensions within its society about how to respond to a world that was leaving fewer and fewer places to hide. Most chilling was its admission that some encounters had been tests, deliberate interactions designed to gauge human responses and gather information about how individuals would react to contact, experiments that had been ongoing for decades as its kind tried to predict what would happen if full disclosure became unavoidable. Maya's audio equipment captured nuances in the creature's voice that suggested emotional complexity, frustration, hope, fear, and something that might have been loneliness, the isolation of a species that had chosen invisibility over the risks of recognition. The creature asked Maya questions in return, wanting to know about human intentions, about whether people like her who sought contact came with peaceful purposes, or whether discovery would inevitably lead to exploitation and destruction. Its concerns revealed a sophisticated understanding of human history, referencing the treatment of indigenous peoples and endangered species with a knowledge that suggested extensive observation of human behavior patterns. The conversation became a negotiation, with the creature trying to assess whether Maya could be trusted to present its kind's existence in a way that might lead to coexistence rather than catastrophe, and Maya struggling to provide assurances she wasn't certain she could guarantee. The other creatures that had positioned themselves around the clearing began to vocalize, their calls creating a chorus that Maya's equipment registered as coming from at least 6 different sources, each with distinct vocal characteristics that suggested individual identities rather than a uniform group. The primary speaker seemed to be translating or summarizing their contributions, explaining that its companions represented different perspectives within their community. Some who supported this contact, others who viewed it as a dangerous mistake, and still others who believed that humanity had already progressed too far to be trusted with knowledge of their existence. The debate playing out in the forest around Maya was apparently one that had been ongoing within the creature's society for generations, and her presence had forced it into the open, making her an unwitting participant in a decision that would affect an entire hidden species. As the conversation continued, Maya noticed that the creature's English was improving in real time, as if the practice of actually speaking with a human was refining skills that had been developed only through passive observation. It began using more complex sentence structures, incorporating idioms and references that suggested it had been listening to human conversations for years, absorbing language through patient eavesdropping on camping groups and hikers who never suspected their words were being studied by an intelligence hidden in the surrounding forest. The creature expressed frustration with the limitations of human language for conveying concepts that existed in its own communication system, describing ideas about forest consciousness and interconnected awareness that didn't translate well into English, but suggested a worldview fundamentally different from human understanding. It spoke of the forest as a living network of trees and animals and its own kind as parts of a larger organism that humans move through without comprehending. And it suggested that this blindness to the deeper patterns of wilderness was why humans could destroy ecosystems without understanding what they were actually eliminating. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all the creatures fall silent. The distant noise of a helicopter, probably a routine Forest Service patrol, but enough to trigger an immediate response from Maya's hidden companions. The primary speaker's voice took on an urgent quality, explaining that they needed to end the contact, that the risk of detection was too great, but before withdrawing it wanted to establish a method for future communication. What it proposed seemed impossible. It described a location deeper in the mountains where Maya could leave messages, a place its kind monitored regularly, and it suggested a schedule for potential future meetings if she proved trustworthy with the information she'd already gathered. The creature made Maya promise something that would haunt her for months afterward, that she would share the recording only with people who would approach the revelation with respect rather than exploitation, a request that assumed she had far more control over information dissemination than any individual actually possessed in the modern world. As the creatures withdrew into the forest, Maya's cameras captured brief glimpses of massive forms moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. Figures that seemed too large to disappear so completely, yet vanished within seconds, leaving only swaying branches and disturbed vegetation as evidence they'd been there at all. The primary speaker's final words were a warning and an invitation, a caution that not all of its kind were as willing to attempt communication, that some territories were defended with violence rather than words, but also an expression of hope that Maya represented a new possibility for a species that was tired of hiding. The voice faded into the forest, and Maya was left alone in the clearing with equipment that had recorded something that would either revolutionize understanding of intelligence and consciousness or destroy her credibility as a researcher, depending on who heard it and whether they chose to believe. Maya remained in the clearing for another hour, her hands shaking as she reviewed the audio files, listening to the conversation replay and trying to convince herself it had actually happened. The recording was clear, undeniable, showing waveforms and frequency patterns that didn't match any known animal, but also didn't match human speech exactly, existing in a space between that suggested a vocal apparatus adapted for different purposes, attempting to mimic human language. Her video footage showed movement, shadows, the disturbance of vegetation, but never a clear image of the speakers, as if they'd positioned themselves with perfect awareness of her camera angles and deliberately stayed just beyond the range of visual documentation. The evidence was compelling but incomplete, enough to prove something extraordinary had occurred, but not enough to satisfy the burden of proof that scientific acceptance would require. The hike back to her vehicle became a journey through a forest that felt fundamentally different from the one she'd entered that morning. Maya found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before, arrangements of stones that might be markers, broken branches positioned in patterns that could be signals, and areas where the forest floor showed signs of regular passage by something that moved on two legs, but left tracks too large and too deep to be human. She realized that the creature's claim of extensive observation was evident everywhere once you knew what to look for, that the forest was full of signs of an intelligence that had been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged not just by physical concealment, but by human assumptions about what was possible. Every sound made her pause, wondering if she was being followed, if her new contacts were ensuring she made it safely out of their territory, or if other members of their kind who hadn't approved of the contact were tracking her movements with less friendly intentions. Maya's heart pounded as she whispered her response into the recording equipment, asking the creature what it wanted her to know, what message it had been waiting to deliver. The being's answer came slowly, each word carefully formed, as if it was translating thoughts from a language far older than English into sounds her human ears could process. It spoke of watching humans for generations, of learning their languages by listening to campfire conversations and radio transmissions that drifted through the forest, of understanding technology through careful observation of the equipment that researchers brought into the wilderness. The creature described a species that had made a collective decision centuries ago to remain hidden, to observe rather than engage, because early encounters with humans had taught them that discovery meant danger, that anything unknown was either destroyed or captured by a species that feared what it couldn't control. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Maya asked how many of them existed in these mountains. The creature's response carried what sounded like sadness. It spoke of a population that had once numbered in the thousands across the Pacific Northwest, but had dwindled to scattered groups of a few hundred, pushed into smaller and smaller territories as human development consumed the wilderness. It described sacred places that had been paved over, migration routes that had been cut by highways, and gathering sites that now sat beneath reservoirs and shopping centers. The being's voice grew heavier as it explained that its kind was facing a choice they'd hoped never to make: continue hiding until there was nowhere left to hide, or risk contact with humans in hopes of finding allies who might help protect what little territory remained. Maya realized with growing horror that she wasn't just documenting an unknown species. She was potentially witnessing the last generation of an ancient civilization in its final desperate attempt to survive. Maya's questions became more urgent, her scientific training warring with the emotional weight of what she was hearing. She asked about their society, their culture, how they'd managed to remain hidden for so long in an age of satellites and thermal imaging. The creature's explanation revealed a sophistication that shattered every assumption Maya had made about what intelligence looked like. It described a network of families spread across multiple mountain ranges, connected not by technology, but by individuals who traveled between groups carrying messages and maintaining social bonds. It spoke of an oral tradition that preserved thousands of years of history, of knowledge about the forest that went deeper than any human science, of an understanding of the interconnected web of life that humans move through without seeing. The being explained that they'd learned to avoid detection through careful study of human behavior patterns. They knew when satellites passed overhead, understood the limitations of thermal cameras, and had developed techniques for moving through the forest that left minimal trace. But most chilling was its admission that they'd also learned to manipulate human perception, to use infrasound and other methods to create feelings of unease that drove people away from areas they wanted to protect, essentially weaponizing human fear to maintain their boundaries. The creature's tone shifted when it began describing the internal conflict within its society about whether to maintain absolute secrecy or attempt controlled contact. It spoke of elders who believed that any interaction with humans would inevitably lead to their destruction, of younger members who argued that hiding was no longer sustainable in a world where wilderness was disappearing, and of a middle faction that believed selective contact with specific humans might be their only path to survival. Maya had apparently been chosen as a test case. Her research, her approach, her obvious respect for the unknown had marked her as someone who might be trusted with knowledge that could either save or doom an entire species. The weight of that responsibility settled over Maya like a physical burden as she realized that her response to this encounter, the choices she made about what to do with this recording, could determine whether these beings continued to exist or were driven into extinction by the exposure she might trigger. As the conversation continued, Maya noticed that other vocalizations were occurring around the clearing. The creature she was speaking with would occasionally pause, and she would hear calls from different directions, followed by responses that suggested consultation was happening, that the being was checking with others before answering certain questions. The primary speaker explained that its companions represented different perspectives within their community, that this conversation was being witnessed and evaluated by others who would help decide whether future contact should continue or whether this experiment should be terminated. Maya asked if she could see them, if they would allow themselves to be photographed, and the creature's response was firm. Visual documentation was not possible, not yet, perhaps not ever. They would control what evidence existed of their presence, would decide what proof humans were allowed to have, because once clear images existed, once their existence became undeniable, they would lose all agency over what happened next. The conversation itself, the audio recording, was a calculated risk, a piece of evidence that proved communication had occurred but still left room for doubt, for deniability, for the possibility of retreat if Maya proved untrustworthy. Maya's audio equipment captured something remarkable in the next exchange. The creature began teaching her words from its own language, simple concepts like forest, water, sky, spoken in sounds that her human vocal cords couldn't hope to reproduce, but that her recording software captured in perfect detail. The being explained that it wanted her to understand that they possessed true language, not just mimicry of human speech, that their communication system was as complex and nuanced as any human tongue. It demonstrated grammatical structures, showed how meaning changed with tonal variations and context, essentially providing linguistic proof that would be invaluable to researchers if Maya chose to share it. But with each word it taught her, the creature also emphasized the trust it was placing in her, the risk it was taking by revealing so much, and the consequences that would follow if that trust was betrayed. The lesson felt less like academic exchange and more like a test of Maya's character, a way of measuring whether she understood the gravity of what was being shared. The conversation took its darkest turn when Maya asked about the aggressive encounters that had been reported over the years, the stories of hikers being chased or intimidated. The creature's response carried what sounded like genuine regret. It acknowledged that fear had been used as a tool, that humans had been deliberately frightened away from certain areas through displays of aggression that were carefully calculated to terrify without causing actual harm. It described these encounters as necessary evils, defensive measures taken to protect territories that were essential to their survival. But it also admitted that not all of its kind agreed with the policy of restraint, that some, particularly younger members who had watched their territories shrink year after year, advocated for more direct confrontation, for using their superior strength and knowledge of the terrain to actively drive humans out of the remaining wilderness. The being's voice carried a warning as it explained that Maya's encounter was happening during a moment of decision within their society, that the choice between continued hiding and open conflict was being debated, and that her response to this contact might influence which path they ultimately chose. As the helicopter sound that had interrupted them earlier grew closer, the creature's final words came in a rush, as if it was trying to convey everything important before the opportunity was lost. It gave Maya specific instructions for a location where she could leave messages, a distinctive rock formation that it described in detail, and it established a schedule for when those messages would be checked. The being made her promise something that would haunt her for months, that she would share the recording only with people who approached the revelation with respect rather than exploitation, that she would use her judgment to determine who could be trusted with knowledge of their existence. It was an impossible request, asking her to control information in a world where nothing stayed secret. But Maya found herself agreeing because the alternative, refusing and potentially ending all future contact, seemed worse. The creature's parting words were both invitation and warning. They would be watching her, monitoring how she handled this responsibility, and future communication would depend entirely on whether she proved worthy of the trust they'd placed in her. The sounds of the creatures withdrawing into the forest came quickly after that, multiple sources moving away from the clearing with coordinated precision that suggested they'd planned their exit strategy before the conversation even began. Maya's cameras captured the vegetation moving, branches swaying as massive forms passed through, but true to their word, the beings never allowed themselves to be clearly visible, maintaining their control over what evidence existed of their presence. Within minutes, the forest had returned to normal sounds, birds resuming their calls, insects buzzing, the ordinary noise of wilderness that had been absent during the entire encounter. Maya sat alone in the clearing, her recording equipment still running, capturing her shaking breaths and the sound of her own voice whispering in disbelief at what had just occurred. The audio file showed a conversation lasting exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. But the implications of those brief minutes would reshape everything Maya thought she knew about intelligence, consciousness, and what it meant to share the world with minds that operated according to rules humanity had never imagined. It was October 21, 2016, when Cara DeLange hiked alone into a remote section of Plumas National Forest. Just after midnight, she reached the trailhead northwest of Quincy, drawn back by weeks of strange vocalizations recorded near a dry creek bed, deep sounds that didn't match any known animal and seemed to answer when she approached. Tonight, she brought a camera. The 40-minute hike through dense fog kept her tense. The temperature hovered in the low 40s. By 1 a.m., she crouched near Manzanita for stability, her recorder clipped on, her audio station blinking nearby. Then the forest fell unnaturally quiet. She felt watched before she heard anything at all. A faint sound came from upslope, not a footfall, but the soft compression of forest debris under significant weight. Then nothing. She waited. Her hand tightened slightly on the camera, but she did not move. Minutes passed. The air felt heavier. She caught a scent on the wind, faint and organic. Musky? Not the sharp smell of a bear or the distinctive odor of a mountain lion. Something else. Something she could not identify. Another sound. Closer now. The snap of a small twig, followed by absolute stillness. Whatever was out there had stopped moving. It was evaluating her, testing whether she was a threat. She kept her posture relaxed, non-threatening, and waited for it to decide. The motion sensor on her audio station remained green. Whatever was watching her was staying just outside the detection radius. Deliberate, controlled. At 1:14 a.m., she heard the first sound. It came from downslope, maybe 50 feet away, hidden in the fog. A low, guttural hum that lasted 4 seconds and then stopped. The sound was deep enough that she felt it in her chest, a vibration that seemed to resonate through her ribcage. It did not sound like a bear. It did not sound like anything she had encountered before. The tone was controlled, sustained, and deliberate. Cara stood motionless, her pulse quickening. She adjusted the camera angle toward the source of the sound and waited for it to come again. Her breathing slowed. She focused on listening, filtering out the wind and the distant rustle of branches. 40 seconds passed. Then the sound repeated, this time closer. It was the same low rumble, but shorter, with a rising inflection at the end. It sounded like a question, like the source was testing whether she was still there, like it was trying to provoke a response. She did not respond. She kept her breathing shallow and her movements minimal. The motion sensor on her audio station switched from red to green. Something had entered the detection radius, something large enough to trigger the infrared beam. At 1:17 a.m., she saw movement. A shape emerged from the fog near the creek bed, roughly 40 feet away. It was tall, far taller than any human, and broad through the shoulders. The figure moved slowly, taking deliberate steps through the underbrush. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, and covered in dark fur or hair that blended with the shadows. The head was massive, the arms hung past the hips, and the posture was stable and controlled. The gait was smooth, not the lumbering shuffle of a bear. What happened next would change everything Cara thought she knew about intelligence in the wild. The creature was not simply searching for food. It was not marking territory. What it was about to do had never been documented in any Sasquatch encounter on record. Cara's hands tightened around the camera. She kept the lens steady, filming the figure as it moved closer to the audio station. The creature stopped approximately 20 feet from the tripod and stood completely still. It was facing the equipment, as if examining it, as if trying to understand what it was. For nearly a minute, Nothing happened. The creature did not move. Kara did not move. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the faint hum of the recorder running on her jacket. Then the creature made a sound. It was not the deep rumble from before. This sound was different. It started low, then shifted into a mid-range tone and ended with a sharp exhalation. The rhythm was deliberate, broken into 3 distinct pulses. It sounded almost like speech, like the creature was trying to form words, like it was attempting to mimic the cadence of human language. Kara's breath caught. She had heard vocalizations on her recordings before, but this was different. This was intentional, structured. The creature was attempting to communicate. She stayed silent, unsure of what to do. The creature turned slightly, shifting its weight, and the motion sensor blinked twice before returning to solid green. The figure was still within detection range, but it had moved. It was no longer facing the equipment. It was facing her direction. Kara froze. She could see the outline clearly now. The creature was looking directly at her. It had seen her immediately. At 1:21 a.m., the creature took 2 steps forward. The movement was smooth and controlled, closing the distance to roughly 30 feet. Kara's heart pounded. She considered retreating, but movement might provoke a response. She remained crouched, keeping the camera raised, and filmed. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The creature stopped again. It tilted its head slightly, as if listening. Then it made another sound. This one was quieter, more controlled, and contained a clear vowel sound in the middle. The sound was drawn out and resonant, followed by a soft consonant at the end. It resembled the structure of human speech, but rendered in a voice too deep and too powerful to belong to any person. Kara realized the creature was experimenting with its voice, testing sounds, exploring what it could produce. She made a decision. She cleared her throat softly, just loud enough to be heard. The creature reacted immediately. Its head snapped toward her, and its body shifted into a slightly crouched posture. For 3 seconds, it remained motionless. Then it repeated the sound it had just made, but louder this time. The vowel sound echoed through the trees, hanging in the cold air. Kara's pulse spiked. She decided to respond. She spoke a single word of greeting, keeping her voice low and calm. The word hung in the air. The creature tilted its head again, processing the sound. Then, after a pause of nearly 10 seconds, it made a sound in response. The sound that came out was deep, guttural, and formless. There was a faint echo of her vocal tone, but nothing resembled actual syllables. It was attempting something, but the result was crude and unrefined. Kara's hands started shaking. She spoke the word again, slower this time, enunciating carefully. The creature responded with another sound. It was no clearer than the first. The vocalization was rough, breathy, with no discernible pattern. Whatever the creature was doing, it was not producing anything close to human speech. Kara felt a mix of fear and awe. She raised the camera higher, ensuring the lens captured the figure in the frame. The recording light blinked steadily, documenting everything. At 1:23 a.m., the creature took several more steps forward, now standing approximately 25 feet away. Kara could see more detail now. The body was covered in dark brown or black hair, matted and uneven. The shoulders were impossibly wide, easily 3 feet across, and the chest was deep and barrel-shaped. The arms were long and muscular, extending well past the hips, and the hands were large, with thick fingers that hung loosely at its sides. The face was partially obscured by shadow, but she could see the shape of a heavy brow ridge and a pronounced jaw. The head was conical, rising to a peak at the crown. The creature shifted its weight, and Kara observed how it moved. The feet were broad and flat, designed for stability on uneven terrain. Each step was planted carefully, heel first, then rolling forward to the toes. The movement was fluid and controlled, nothing like the stiff gait of a person in a costume. The knees bent naturally, absorbing the creature's mass with each shift. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, the hands occasionally flexing open and closed. The fingers were thick and powerful, capable of gripping branches or tearing bark. As she watched, the creature reached out and touched the trunk of a nearby pine tree. The motion was exploratory, not aggressive. It ran its palm down the bark, testing the texture, then brought its hand to its face briefly. Scent checking. The behavior mirrored what she had seen in gorillas investigating new territory. The creature's shoulders rolled as it adjusted its posture. The musculature was dense and powerful, designed for climbing and pulling. The chest expanded with each breath, the ribcage visible beneath the hair. The head turned slowly from side to side, scanning the area with methodical precision. The ears, small and close to the skull, twitched occasionally, tracking sounds Kara could not hear. It crouched slightly and placed one hand on the ground, balancing its weight between 3 points of contact. The posture was cautious, non-threatening, but ready. Kara noticed something else, a smell. It was faint at first, carried on the cold air between them, but it grew stronger as the creature moved. The odor was musky and organic, like wet animal fur mixed with earth and something else she could not identify. It was not unpleasant, but it was distinctly wild. The scent confirmed what her eyes were telling her. This was not a person in a costume. This was a living creature with its own biology, its own presence. The creature's breathing was audible now. Deep, measured breaths that created small clouds of condensation in the cold air. Each exhale produced a soft rushing sound, like wind through a cave opening. The respiratory capacity was enormous. Whatever this creature was, its lungs were far larger than any human's. The creature made another sound. This one was different. It was not a mimicry attempt. It was a vocalization from its own repertoire, a low, rhythmic hum that rose and fell in pitch. The sound lasted nearly 8 seconds and contained multiple tonal shifts. The pattern was structured, but whether it carried specific meaning or was simply a complex call remained unknowable. Kara did not understand the sounds, but she recognized the pattern. The creature remained still and vocalized after she spoke, matching her timing rather than her words. It was not threatening her. It was not charging or displaying aggression. She decided to keep talking. She spoke slowly, enunciating each word, and introduced herself by name. The creature listened. Its head tilted again, and its body remained still. The massive chest rose and fell with each breath. After a pause of nearly 15 seconds, it attempted to respond. The sound that emerged was a low rumble, followed by a sharper vocalization. The sounds were rough and lacked any clear structure. Whatever the creature was doing, it bore no resemblance to speech. She repeated her name alone, speaking it clearly and deliberately. The creature responded with a sound that was low and guttural. There was no clear pattern, no recognizable attempt at replication. It was simply vocalizing in response to her voice. Kara felt tears welling in her eyes, though she did not know if it was from fear or wonder. She was standing face to face with something that was not human, something that was reacting to her movements and voice. At 1:31 a.m., the creature crouched slightly and placed one hand on the ground. The motion was deliberate, non-threatening. It was lowering itself to appear less imposing. Kara noticed the hand was enormous, easily twice the size of her own, with long fingers and thick nails that resembled claws, but appeared blunt. The palm was broad and covered in the same dark hair that covered the rest of the body. The creature made another sound, this time softer. It was a single syllable, drawn out and gentle. The tone was calm, almost soothing. Kara responded in kind, keeping her voice low and steady. She spoke reassuring words, though she suspected the creature understood tone more than language. She told it she meant no harm, that she was simply observing, that she was not a threat. The creature did not repeat her words this time. Instead, it made a series of sounds, separated by pauses. The vocalizations varied in pitch and duration, suggesting some kind of internal structure, but Kara could not identify any patterns that resembled human language. Kara decided to try something. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a granola bar. She unwrapped it slowly, the crinkling of the wrapper loud in the silence. The creature's head shifted immediately, tracking the sound with precision. Kara broke off a piece of the bar and held it out in her open palm, extending her arm slowly and deliberately. She kept her movements non-threatening, her posture relaxed. The creature stared at her hand. It did not move toward her, but it did not retreat either. Its eyes, barely visible in the darkness, remained fixed on the offering. After a long pause of nearly 20 seconds, it made a soft sound, almost like a hum of acknowledgement. Then it stood upright again, rising to its full height of over 7 feet. The motion was fluid, effortless, demonstrating immense strength and balance. Kara lowered her hand, realizing the creature was not interested in the food. It was interested in the interaction itself. At 1:38 a.m., the creature spoke again. This time, the sound was more complex. It started with a low hum, transitioned into a mid-range tone, and ended with what might have been a stopped consonant. The structure suggested deliberate vocal control, but the meaning was impossible to decipher. Kara listened carefully. She responded, keeping her tone gentle. She told the creature she did not understand, but that she was listening. The creature tilted its head, processing her words. Then it repeated the sound. The consistency suggested the vocalization had meaning within the creature's own communication system, but what that meaning was remained unknowable. The creature then did something unexpected. It placed its hand on its own chest, over the area where a human heart would be. The gesture was deliberate. It held the position for 3 seconds while making a low, rumbling sound. The behavior resembled a posture shift or calming gesture, similar to what great apes do when displaying non-aggression. Kara felt a chill run through her. She was witnessing something that defied easy explanation. A creature attempting to interact with her through vocalizations and physical gestures. At 1:43 a.m., the creature made a new sound. This one was sharper, more urgent. It was a single syllable, repeated 3 times in quick succession. The rhythm was staccato, insistent. The tone had shifted from curiosity to urgency. The creature was making an urgent call, trying to focus her awareness on something specific. She responded, telling the creature she was listening, that she was paying attention. The creature took a step back, creating more distance. Its body turned partially toward the forest upslope. One arm moved outward slightly, not a clear point, but a directional motion. The head turned in the same direction. The message was readable, but subtle. Something in that direction had its attention. What the creature had sensed was already approaching. Within minutes, Kara would understand why the creature was trying to warn her, and she would realize that the alarm call it was about to make would be the difference between making it out of the forest alive or becoming another disappearance statistic in Plumas County. Kara followed the line of the creature's gesture, trying to see what it was indicating. She could make out the dark shapes of trees and underbrush. She did not understand what the creature was trying to communicate. Was there something in that direction? Was it warning her? Was it trying to show her something? She looked back at the creature and shook her head slowly, trying to convey her confusion. The creature lowered its arm. It made another sound, this one forceful and sustained. The vocalization was a single sharp exhalation, followed by a drawn-out low tone. It did not sound like any English word, but the urgency was unmistakable. Kara's stomach tightened. Whatever the sound meant in the creature's communication system, the tone conveyed alarm. She asked the creature to clarify, her voice shaking slightly. The creature repeated the sound, louder and more insistent this time. The urgency had intensified. Kara felt a wave of fear wash over her. The creature was not being aggressive, but the urgency in its tone was clear. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The creature had detected something she could not yet perceive. She took a slow step backward, keeping her eyes on the creature. It did not follow. It simply stood there, Watching her, its massive frame tense and alert, focused on something beyond her position. At 1:47 a.m., Kara heard another sound. This one did not come from the creature in front of her. It came from deeper in the forest, upslope, in the direction the creature had indicated. It was another vocalization, similar in register, but different in tone, lower, more resonant. The sound carried differently through the trees. The creature in front of her reacted immediately. Its entire posture changed. The shoulders squared, the head lowered slightly. It turned fully toward the new sound and made a sharp vocalization in response. The sound was loud, forceful, and carried territorial assertion. The response from upslope was another deep vocalization. The first creature responded immediately with a louder, more forceful call. The sound resonated through the trees, a deep boom that Kara felt in her chest. It was a territorial assertion, clear and unmistakable. The creature squared its shoulders and turned fully toward the source of the approaching presence. From upslope came another call, lower in pitch and longer in duration. The second creature was answering the challenge. The first creature responded with 3 sharp exhalations in rapid succession, each one louder than the last. The pattern was aggressive, escalating. Then came a sound Kara had only heard in documentaries about gorillas. The first creature grabbed a dead branch from a nearby shrub and snapped it cleanly in half. The crack echoed through the forest. It dropped the broken pieces and made another vocalization, this one sharper and more insistent. The display was unmistakable, a show of strength, a warning. The second creature responded with its own call, but this time the tone had shifted. It was lower, less aggressive. The first creature held its ground, chest expanded, head slightly lowered. It made one more call, sustained and forceful, then waited. Silence. 10 seconds passed. 20. The first creature remained motionless, body oriented upslope, maintaining its defensive posture. Then, faintly, Kara heard movement in the distance. Not approaching, retreating. The second creature was backing down. The first creature did not relax immediately. It remained tense, listening, ensuring the threat had passed. Only after a full minute of silence did its posture begin to shift. The territorial challenge was over. The boundary had been established. The creature made one final vocalization toward the forest, then turned its head back toward Kara. It repeated the urgent sound it had made earlier. The creature took one step in her direction, not threateningly, but insistently. Its body angled slightly toward the trail. The message was clear even without words. She needed to leave. Kara understood there was another one, and whatever was approaching had triggered a territorial response from the first creature. The creature in front of her was asserting dominance over this section of forest. Kara just happened to be within the boundaries it was defending. She nodded quickly and took another step back, acknowledging the situation. The creature did not respond with vocalizations this time. It simply held its position, body-oriented, toward the source of the approaching threat. Its posture was defensive, territorial. Whatever was coming was violating claimed space, and the first creature was making its stance clear. Kara turned and moved quickly but carefully through the underbrush, heading back toward the trail. She kept the camera running, though she was no longer filming anything useful. Her focus was on getting out. She heard another exchange of vocalizations in the distance. The two creatures were still calling back and forth, establishing territorial boundaries through sound. She did not look back. She moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, her headlamp cutting through the darkness. The forest felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted. As she moved, she became aware of movement somewhere in the forest to her left. Not close, but present. She could hear occasional sounds through the undergrowth, but nothing that suggested active pursuit. Whatever was out there was moving through its own territory, not chasing her specifically. Kara maintained her pace. Her heart hammered. The sounds to her left faded after another minute. The forest went quiet again. By 1:52 a.m., she reached the trail. She broke into a jog, her breath coming in short bursts. She did not stop until she was back at the trailhead, standing next to her vehicle with the doors locked. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the keys. She sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, her hands still shaking, her heart still racing, before she finally started the engine. She drove back to Quincy in silence, replaying the encounter in her mind. The creature had made vocalizations in response to her voice, and when a territorial dispute began, she had been caught in the middle. The first creature's behavior had bought her time to leave, whether intentionally or simply as a side effect of defending its claimed area. The following morning, Kara reviewed the footage on her camera. The video was low resolution and obscured, but the audio was clear. She could hear her own voice, followed by the creature's vocalizations. The sounds were deep, guttural, and bore no resemblance to human speech. She could hear the rhythmic calls. She could hear the final urgent sound before she fled. She played the segments repeatedly. The creature had not produced recognizable words. The vocalization showed some variation, but remained rough and formless. There was no clear pattern of improvement or imitation. What struck her most was the reactivity. The creature did not vocalize randomly. When she made sounds, it responded with its own calls. The exchange had a back-and-forth quality, though the content remained unintelligible. The chest gesture replayed in her mind. The creature had made a deliberate physical motion while vocalizing. The behavior suggested a non-threatening display, though its exact purpose was unclear. Kara saved the file and made multiple backups across different devices and cloud storage. She considered submitting the evidence to the Forest Service or to academic institutions, but she hesitated. The encounter had been too personal, too profound, to hand over to an agency that might dismiss or bury it. The creature had engaged with her in a way she never thought possible. Instead, she kept the footage private. She shared it with only a handful of trusted colleagues under strict confidentiality agreements. The responses were mixed. Some believed the audio was authentic and represented groundbreaking evidence of non-human speech capability. Others questioned the source, suggesting the sounds could have been produced by a human hoaxer or misidentified wildlife. The debate would likely continue for years, but Kara knew what she had experienced. She had been there. She had seen the creature standing less than 25 feet away. She had heard it vocalize in response to her voice. She had heard the urgent calls when territorial conflict began. The creature had not tried to harm her. It had engaged in what appeared to be responsive behavior, though the exact nature of the interaction remained ambiguous. And when another presence arrived, the territorial response had given her the opportunity to leave. Kara returned to the site twice in the following weeks, but she never encountered the creature again. The motion-triggered audio stations continued recording for another month, but the vocalizations stopped. The forest fell silent. Whatever had been there was gone, or had chosen to remain hidden. She completed her graduate program in 2019 and moved to Oregon, where she now works as a conservation biologist. She rarely discusses the encounter, but in private, she has never wavered about what happened that night. The creature was real. The sounds were real. For a few minutes in a fog-covered forest, a human and an unknown primate exchanged sounds that neither fully understood. The footage remains in her possession. No agency has confirmed it, and no similar recordings have surfaced. What stays with her is the memory of a creature responding to her voice, and the realization that its warning gave her the chance to escape. It was late March when I first reviewed the trail camera footage that would change everything. In the frame, my pasture fence line appeared normal for exactly 4 seconds. Then, at the far right edge of the screen, a massive silhouette stepped partially into view before immediately retreating back into darkness. The figure stood upright. Its shoulder width exceeded anything I had seen in decades of living on this property. I replayed the footage 17 times that morning, trying to extract any additional detail from the grainy night vision recording. Each viewing confirmed the same disturbing facts. The figure moved with deliberate caution, its posture suggesting awareness of the camera's position. The way it pulled back indicated intelligence, not the random movement of wildlife wandering through the frame. Something knew the camera was there and had chosen to remain just outside its full field of view. The next morning, I found a section of fence along the eastern perimeter bent outward. The metal posts, designed to withstand livestock pressure, had been pushed from the inside as though something with tremendous force had tested the boundary. I measured the deformation carefully. The fence had been displaced approximately 14 inches from its original position. No wires were snapped. No posts were uprooted. Just a deliberate, controlled bend that suggested strength far beyond what any local animal possessed. Black bears in the region typically weighed between 200 and 400 pounds and left claw marks when interacting with structures. This fence showed no scratches, no tears in the wire mesh, no indication of an animal trying to get through a barrier. Instead, it looked like something had simply placed its weight against the fence and pushed, testing the strength of the boundary without any intention of crossing it. But what happened 4 nights later made the fence incident seem like nothing more than a gentle warning. 4 nights after the fence incident, my cattle began acting strangely. Around 9:30 p.m., all 16 heads clustered tightly into the back corner of the pasture, facing outward in a defensive formation I had only seen when coyotes prowled nearby. But there were no coyotes that night, just an unnatural stillness that settled over the property like a held breath. The temperature had dropped to around 54 degrees, typical for early April evenings in this region. The moon was 3 days past full, providing enough ambient light to see shapes and movement across the open pasture. Yet despite the visibility, I could identify nothing that would explain my cattle's behavior. They stood pressed together, their breath forming small clouds in the cool air, their attention fixed on the tree line to the east. Standing on my porch, I listened. The usual chorus of crickets and distant owl calls had gone silent. In 23 years of living on this property, I had learned to read the night sounds. Silence meant a predator, but predators didn't silence an entire forest. Coyotes, bobcats, even the occasional mountain lion reported in the area, none of them created this kind of absolute quiet. The stillness felt wrong, as though every creature within a half-mile radius had simultaneously decided to stop making noise. Then, from somewhere deep in the tree line, roughly 80 yards away, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, spaced about 3 seconds apart. Each step produced a heavy crunch in the underbrush that suggested significant weight. The steps moved parallel to the fence line for nearly 2 minutes before stopping completely. The rhythm never varied. The pattern felt purposeful, like something walking a patrol route, rather than an animal wandering in search of food. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through darkness, but revealed nothing except swaying branches and empty space between trees. Whatever had been there was either gone or standing perfectly still beyond the light's reach. I swept the beam back and forth along the tree line for nearly 5 minutes, searching for any reflection of eyes, any movement, any confirmation of what my ears had detected. The light showed only trees and shadows. Morning brought the first physical evidence. In a patch of mud near the cattle's water trough, I found a print. The impression measured roughly 17 inches long and nearly 8 inches across at the widest point. 5 distinct toe marks pressed deep into the soil, each toe showing individual definition that ruled out any kind of boot or artificial print. The depth of the impression suggested a weight far exceeding that of any black bear native to the region. I had seen bear prints before. They showed claw marks extending beyond the toe pads. This print showed no claws. The stride length between prints measured close to 5 feet, indicating something that moved on 2 legs with a gait that no 4-legged animal could replicate. I photographed the print from multiple angles, placing a dollar bill next to it for scale reference. The bill measured 6 inches long. The print dwarfed it. I made a plaster cast, mixing the powder carefully and pouring it into the impression with the precision of someone who understood I might need proof of what I was seeing. While the plaster dried, I walked the fence line looking for additional prints or disturbances. I found 3 more impressions in softer soil near the eastern corner post, all showing the same massive size and bipedal stride pattern. Whatever had walked my property the previous night had weight enough to sink nearly 2 inches into packed earth. I thought finding physical proof would give me some sense of control over the situation. I was wrong. What came next proved that whatever was out there wasn't just passing through, it was studying me. The following week brought a new pattern. On 3 consecutive nights, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my barn. Not random wandering, but a deliberate, measured pace that suggested purposeful movement. The steps always followed the same route, starting at the northwest corner, moving clockwise around the entire structure, then stopping at the exact point where they began. The rhythm never varied. Heavy step, pause, heavy step, pause. The pattern was so consistent it felt rehearsed, as though whatever was out there had walked that same path many times before. On the second night, I timed the intervals with my watch. Each circuit took roughly 4 minutes, disturbingly consistent for something that was supposed to be wildlife. The consistency was unsettling. Animals don't move with that kind of precision. I tried to catch a glimpse from my bedroom window, which offered a partial view of the barn's southern side. But each time I looked out, the footsteps would pause immediately, as though the creature could sense when it was being observed. The moment I stepped back from the window, the walking would resume. After the 3rd attempt, I gave up and simply listened, mapping the creature's route in my mind by tracking the sound of each footfall against the barn's exterior. The footsteps were heavy enough that I could feel faint vibrations through my house's foundation when the creature passed the closest point to my bedroom. Based on the sound and the slight tremor, the creature was extremely heavy, though I had no way to confirm any specific weight. The only certainty was that nothing in the region's natural wildlife catalog matched what I was hearing. On the 4th morning, I found something that elevated my concern from confusion to genuine unease. A metal feed bin lid, which weighed close to 40 pounds, had been lifted off its container and placed upright against the barn wall. Not knocked over, not dragged. Carefully positioned in a standing position that required both strength and deliberate intention. I examined the bin carefully. The lid showed no dents, no scratch marks, no indication it had been pried or forced. It had simply been removed and relocated with care that suggested opposable grip, strength, and problem-solving intelligence. The bin had been stored in the barn, with the lid secured by its own weight and a simple friction fit. Removing it required understanding how the lid worked, not just brute force. Over the next 5 nights, a disturbing pattern emerged. Each morning, I found 3 gates unlatched in the exact same sequence. First, the gate to the chicken coop, then the gate to the equipment shed, then the gate to the back pasture. Never in a different order, never just 1 or 2. Always all 3, always in that specific progression. The latches showed no damage, no scratch marks from claws, no pry marks from tools. They had been lifted cleanly, the way a person would open them, but at times when no person should have been on my property. Whatever was visiting my farm was returning to the same locations night after night, interacting with my property in ways that demonstrated both memory and intention. But then it did something that made all those previous incidents feel like practice runs for what was really coming. On April 19th, while walking the fence line just before sunset, I experienced something that crossed the line from strange to genuinely frightening. As I walked along the tree line bordering my property, every single one of my footsteps was answered by another footstep from within the woods. The mimic matched my rhythm perfectly. When I took 2 quick steps, 2 heavy steps responded. When I stopped, the echo stopped instantly. The evening light was fading quickly, the sun already below the horizon, leaving only the pale glow of twilight filtering through the trees. Visibility extended about 40 yards into the forest before the shadows became too thick to penetrate. Whatever was matching my movements remained just beyond that visible range, hidden in the darkening woods, but close enough that I could hear each footfall with perfect clarity. I tested it deliberately. 1 step. The forest answered with 1 step, the sound coming from approximately 30 yards into the trees. 3 steps in quick succession. 3 heavy impacts responded immediately, matching my rhythm with precision that seemed impossible for random coincidence. I stopped and counted to 10. Silence. I took 2 slow steps. 2 slow, heavy steps answered from the same location. I changed my pace, walking in an irregular pattern. 2 quick steps, pause, 1 slow step, pause, 3 quick steps. The mimic matched every variation perfectly, maintaining the same approximate distance while demonstrating an ability to adapt its movement to my changing rhythm. The moment I turned and walked quickly back toward the house, the mimic footsteps stopped completely. Silence returned to the woods. Whatever was out there could move through the tree line without revealing itself, close enough for every step to match mine. The precision didn't feel like wandering, it felt like something paying close attention to me. I invested in additional trail cameras, hoping to finally capture clear footage of whatever was stalking my property. Instead, the cameras seemed to fail at the exact moments something should have triggered them. Footage showed clear recordings of deer, possums, and my own movements during daylight hours. But at night, during the times I heard activity around the barn or near the house, the cameras produced corrupted files at the exact moments the infrared triggers should have activated, leaving blank segments instead of footage. One camera, positioned near the eastern fence line, captured a single frame that made it through uncorrupted. The image showed a blurred shoulder and part of a massive arm reaching past the camera's field of view. The arm appeared covered in dark hair and measured thicker than any human limb. The frame before and after showed nothing but static. Around this same period, my cattle began refusing to graze anywhere near the eastern fence. They would walk to within 20 feet of that boundary and then turn away, choosing to crowd into the western section of the pasture even when fresh grass grew untouched on the eastern side. They were avoiding an area where they sensed danger. I tried to tell myself the worst was over, that maybe the creature was moving on. Then one night it answered me back, and I realized the terror was only beginning. On the night of May 2nd, while standing on my back porch, I heard 2 distinct knocking sounds from deep within the woods. The sounds were sharp and resonant, like wood striking wood with significant force. The knocks came from a location I estimated to be roughly 200 yards into the forest. I had read about tree knocking, about how some researchers believed large primates used the sound to communicate over distance. I had always dismissed such claims as folklore and misidentification, but standing there in the dark, hearing those deliberate impacts echo through the trees, I made a decision that surprised myself. I picked up a thick branch from the woodpile and struck it hard against a fence post. 1 solid knock. Then I waited. The response came within 5 seconds. 3 knocks, rapid succession, from a completely different direction than the original sounds. The new knocks came from somewhere northwest of my position, perhaps 150 yards away. Whatever had answered me had either moved with impossible speed, or there were 2 of them communicating across the darkness. I did not knock again. Some experiments should not be repeated. The morning of May 7th brought one of the most unnerving discoveries of the entire ordeal. I walked out to the pasture to find all 16 cattle arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, as though they had been deliberately herded into that formation during the night. The circle measured approximately 20 feet in diameter. Each animal stood calm and uninjured, but the positioning was precise in a way that natural animal behavior does not produce. The fencing showed no breaks. No gates had been opened. Whatever had arranged my livestock into that circle had done so without causing panic, injury, or any attempt to harm them. The display seemed designed not to predate, but to demonstrate capability, to show that it could control my animals any time it chose to. What happened 3 days later proved it could get even closer than I ever imagined. May 10th marked the first time I saw the creature at close range. I was checking the water trough near the barn around 8:30 p.m., just after sunset. The shadows were thick, but not yet completely dark. As I bent down to inspect the valve, I felt the sudden, instinctive sensation of being watched. I straightened slowly and turned my head toward the equipment area. There, standing directly behind my tractor roughly 25 feet away, was a massive upright figure. Even in the dim light, the size was unmistakable. The silhouette stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that extended far beyond human proportions. The head appeared slightly conical, sitting atop a thick neck with almost no visible separation. For 3 seconds, neither the creature nor I moved. Then, without any sound of effort or hurry, it took one enormous step backward and disappeared into the darkness beyond the barn. No running, no crashing through brush. Just a single controlled movement that carried it out of sight with unnatural silence. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I had finally seen it clearly enough to know that whatever was stalking my farm was not a bear, not a person, and not anything I could report to authorities without being dismissed outright. But seeing it from 25 feet away was nothing compared to what it did next, when it marked my home as its territory. The scratches appeared on 3 trees surrounding my house at roughly equal distances. The marks ran from about 7 feet off the ground down to roughly 5 feet, carved in parallel lines that looked like they had been made by something dragging downward with significant pressure. The edges of the scratches were smooth, not jagged, like claw marks would be. They appeared almost burnished, as though made by something scraping with controlled force rather than tearing. The 3 trees formed a rough triangle with my house at the center, suggesting the marks were intentional boundary indicators rather than random damage. Whatever had made them wanted me to know my house was now inside a defined perimeter. The question that kept me awake that night was simple and terrifying. Was I inside a territory or inside a trap? I got my answer 3 nights later when it climbed onto my porch for the first time. At 3:17 a.m. on May 15th, I woke to the sound of my porch boards creaking under extreme weight. My front porch was built from oak planks over solid joists, designed to support furniture and foot traffic without noise. Yet each step produced a deep groan that indicated something far heavier than any person was moving across the wood. The footsteps moved slowly from left to right, pausing every few seconds as though the creature was testing each board before committing its full weight. I could hear breathing through the front door, the same slow, controlled respiration I'd come to recognize. I remained completely still in my bed, barely breathing myself, knowing that the door was unlocked, knowing that only a single wooden barrier separated me from something that could tear that door off its hinges if it chose to. After nearly 2 minutes, the footsteps moved back across the porch and descended the stairs. I heard them fade into the distance, moving toward the barn. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. The porch was terrifying enough. But 2 nights later, it showed me just how much force it could bring to bear if it wanted to. At approximately 1:30 a.m., a violent slam shook the barn so hard that I felt the vibration in my house 40 yards away. My cattle inside erupted into panic, crashing against their stalls and bellowing in terror. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, certain I would find a vehicle had crashed into the structure or a tree had fallen against the wall. Instead, I found a deep dent in the barn's exterior metal siding, shaped like a shoulder or torso impression. The dent measured roughly 3 feet wide and extended about 18 inches in height. The metal had buckled inward from a single massive impact. No fallen branches, and nothing that could explain the force required to damage reinforced barn siding that severely. Whatever had hit the wall had done so with enough power to terrify my livestock and leave structural damage that would cost hundreds of dollars to repair. The dent felt like a warning rather than random impact. On May 21st, one of my trail cameras finally captured something that made it through without corruption. The footage showed a single frame of an eye reflecting the camera's infrared light. The eye appeared at a height of approximately 7 feet off the ground, far above where any human eye would be positioned. The reflection showed a reddish-orange color, typical of eyeshine, but the size and placement were wrong for any known animal in the region. The eye blinked once, a slow, deliberate closure and reopening before the feed cut to complete black. The timestamp showed 11:43 p.m. The camera had been positioned facing a trail that led from the woods toward the barn, meaning whatever had triggered it had been approaching the property when the image was captured. I reviewed the frame dozens of times, zooming in on every detail. The eyes showed awareness, not the blank stare of a startled animal. It appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as though the creature knew exactly where the device was positioned and had chosen to stare into it before cutting the feed. Then it began circling my house at night, and I realized it was no longer content to just watch from a distance. On May 24th, I discovered footprints that circled my entire house for the first time. The tracks formed a complete loop around the foundation, pressed into soft soil and patches of remaining mud from recent rain. The prints were deeper than previous impressions, indicating the creature had been standing in each location for extended periods, rather than simply walking past. At certain points, the tracks showed where the figure had stood facing the house, positioned directly in line with windows or doors. The spacing between prints grew shorter near the back porch, suggesting slower, more careful movement in that area. The creature was no longer maintaining distance. It was studying the house in detail, testing approaches, and spending more time at closer range during each visit. The pattern showed escalation toward some kind of conclusion that I could sense building like pressure before a storm. Over the next 3 nights, the visits came earlier and lasted longer. Where the creature had previously arrived well after midnight, now it approached the property as early as 9 p.m. The breathing at the windows occurred multiple times each night. The footsteps circled the house repeatedly, rather than just once. I began sleeping with my phone charged and ready, my flashlight within reach, and my bedroom door locked, despite knowing that a lock would provide no real protection against something that could dent metal barn siding with a single impact. On the afternoon of May 27th, while repairing fence line, I heard movement in the woods and caught a glimpse of a massive shape keeping pace with me as I worked, staying just inside the tree line about 50 yards away. It was watching me during daylight now, not just at night. That evening, after sunset, I heard it settle somewhere just outside the barn. The sound was like something large lowering itself to the ground, followed by silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something waiting. Then the storm came, and in the lightning flashes, I finally saw exactly what had been stalking me for 2 months. The power went out at 10:37 p.m. My entire property dropped into complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning from a storm system moving through the area. The outage wasn't unusual for a spring storm, but the timing made it feel intentional, even though there was no proof of anything beyond weather. In those brief bursts of light, I saw it. Standing in my front yard, roughly 30 feet from the porch, was the full silhouette of the creature. The lightning revealed massive head structure that appeared slightly conical, with a pronounced brow ridge that cast deep shadows across where the face would be. The shoulders seemed impossibly broad, extending far beyond human proportions, giving the figure a wedge-shaped upper body that tapered to a narrower waist. The arms hung past where its knees would be, the hands appearing massive even in silhouette. The creature stood completely still, facing the house directly. In that frozen moment of illumination, I could see it was not leaning or crouching. It stood fully upright with perfect posture, its height exceeding 8 feet by what appeared to be several inches. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. The stillness was wrong for any living thing caught in a lightning flash. Most creatures startled by sudden light would flinch or react. This one simply stood, as though it had been waiting in that exact position for me to see it. Another flash of lightning 3 seconds later. It had moved 10 feet closer. No sound of footsteps. No visible motion between the darkness and the light. Just a position shift that occurred between moments of illumination, as though the creature could cross distance during the blackness without disturbing the ground or making any audible approach. I retreated to my bedroom and activated my phone's audio recorder, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the device. Through the walls, I heard heavy, slow footsteps approaching the house. Each step produced a deep impact that I felt through the floor, the vibrations traveling up through the foundation and into my bones. The steps were methodical, measured, carrying weight that compressed the earth with each footfall. Then came breathing at my bedroom window, so close I could hear the slight whistle of air moving through whatever served as the creature's nostrils. The recording captured it clearly, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that continued for nearly 30 seconds. Each breath moved significant volume of air, the sound deeper and more resonant than human breathing, suggesting lung capacity, far exceeding normal mammalian proportions for even large animals. I remained frozen in my bed, the phone clutched in my trembling hand, recording equipment that felt absurdly inadequate for documenting what was happening outside my window. The breathing continued with mechanical regularity. Inhale for 3 seconds. Exhale for 4. Inhale for 3. Exhale for 4. The creature was not exerting itself. It was not agitated. It was simply standing at my window, breathing calmly while I cowered inside. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low vocalization, not quite a growl, but deeper than any human voice could produce, that resonated through the walls like a subsonic vibration. The sound lasted approximately 4 seconds before fading into a final, long exhale. The vocalization felt intentional, directed, as though the creature was announcing its presence in a way that required acknowledgement. The recording captured everything: the breathing, the vocalization, the exhale, and then the sound of footsteps moving away from the house. I listened until I could no longer hear anything except my own breathing and the sound of rain beginning to fall. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I walked into those woods following the trail where I'd seen the creature disappear. I don't know what I hoped to find. Answers, maybe. Proof that would make someone believe me. Or maybe I just needed to face whatever was out there on my own terms instead of waiting for it to come back to my window one more time. I followed tracks that led deeper into the forest, past the creek bed where the ground turned soft and muddy. The prints were fresh, enormous, pressed deep into the earth. I kept walking, following them further than I should have, until I reached a clearing I'd never seen before, despite living on this land for over 2 decades. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate, the same rhythm I'd come to know over the past 2 months. I turned around, and there it stood at the edge of the clearing, fully visible in the morning light for the first time. It was bigger than I'd even imagined. The face showed intelligence in the eyes, something that looked almost human, but fundamentally wasn't. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it took a step toward me. I don't remember what happened after that. On March 8, 2024, 26-year-old Sarah Chen drove alone into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest with nothing but a 2-person tent. She'd chosen a campsite that didn't appear on any official park map, a clearing she'd discovered through satellite imagery that promised complete isolation. When she began the hike, her GPS device began showing coordinates that didn't match her downloaded maps, placing her miles from where she actually stood. Around the 2-hour mark, Sarah noticed something that made her pause: a massive footprint pressed deep into the mud beside the trail, easily 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions that were too human-like to be a bear, but far too large to be anything she could name. When she looked closer, she could see 4 more prints leading into the dense undergrowth, spaced apart in a stride pattern that suggested something walking upright. Sarah's unease grew when she discovered deep parallel gouges carved into tree bark at a height of roughly 8 feet, 3 distinct marks that ran horizontally across the trunk. The wood inside was fresh, still weeping sap, which meant whatever had made them had been here recently, perhaps within the last few hours. She found similar markings on 6 more trees as she continued, always at the same impossible height, always 3 parallel gouges positioned in a way that seemed to mark territorial boundaries. The pattern was too consistent to be random damage, and Sarah began to wonder what kind of creature would need to mark its territory at a height that exceeded any known animal in these mountains. The silence became oppressive as Sarah pushed deeper into the forest, but it wasn't complete silence anymore. She began to notice sounds that didn't fit. Branches would crack in the distance, always just far enough away that she couldn't see what had caused the noise, and occasionally she would hear what sounded like footsteps paralleling her path through the dense undergrowth, keeping pace with her movements. Twice she stopped completely and held her breath, listening, and both times the forest sound stopped as well, as if whatever was out there was also listening, also waiting. When she started walking again, the sounds would resume after a few seconds, maintaining that same careful distance. When Sarah finally reached the clearing just before sunset, she felt an immediate sense of unease that she couldn't rationalize away. The space was perfectly circular, roughly 50 feet in diameter, with grass that grew in strange spiral patterns radiating out from the center. The trees surrounding the clearing were marked with those same deep gouges at exactly the same height. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any dead wood or fallen branches within the clearing itself, as if someone had been maintaining the space. But it was what she found in the center that made her blood run cold. A circle of smooth river stones arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, and in the middle, a collection of bones that had been carefully sorted by size and type, bleached white, but positioned with obvious intention. She set up her tent near the eastern edge of the clearing, trying to shake off the growing feeling that she was intruding somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Her hands trembled as she hammered in the tent stakes, constantly glancing over her shoulder at the tree line. As she worked, she noticed patches of grass that had been flattened in rough circular patterns, as if something massive had been bedding down in multiple locations, and what appeared to be tufts of dark hair caught on low-hanging branches, coarse strands that were too thick to be from any deer or elk. The tent went up without problems, but her camping stove refused to light, despite having worked perfectly at home, and her phone showed no signal at all. The sun was setting rapidly now, the shadows between the trees growing deeper and somehow more solid. As Sarah ate a cold dinner, she became aware of a smell drifting across the clearing, musky and earthy, like wet animal fur mixed with something stronger, more pungent. The scent came and went on the evening breeze, persistent enough that she couldn't ignore it. When she walked to the edge of the clearing to investigate, she found fresh tracks pressed into the soft earth, the same massive footprints she'd seen on the trail, but these were even clearer. The prints circled her tent in a wide arc, suggesting that something had examined her campsite while she was setting up, then retreated back into the forest to watch from a distance. Whatever had made those tracks was still out there, somewhere in the darkening woods, and it knew exactly where she was. As darkness fell completely, Sarah noticed that the usual sounds of a forest at night, insects, owls, the rustling of nocturnal animals beginning their evening activities, were entirely absent from the clearing. The silence was so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through her ears, could hear every tiny movement she made inside her tent, amplified to an almost painful degree. She lay in her sleeping bag trying to read by headlamp, but found herself unable to concentrate on the words, her attention constantly drawn to the darkness beyond her tent walls and the growing certainty that something out there was paying very close attention to her presence. Around 10 p.m., she turned off her headlamp and tried to sleep, telling herself that her unease was just the normal anxiety of being alone in an unfamiliar place. That morning would bring perspective and the courage to laugh at her nighttime fears. Sarah woke suddenly at 1:33 a.m. to a sound that didn't belong in any forest she'd ever studied or imagined. It started as a low vibration that she felt more than heard, resonating through the ground beneath her sleeping pad and traveling up through her body until her teeth ached and her vision blurred. The sound built slowly into something that resembled a voice, but operated at frequencies that seemed designed to bypass her ears entirely and speak directly to the primitive parts of her brain that still remembered when humans were prey. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the vocalization continued for nearly a minute before fading back into that oppressive silence, leaving her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The silence that followed the call lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah as she lay frozen in her sleeping bag, straining to hear any indication of what had made that impossible sound. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the clearing with a measured pace that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than the random wandering of an animal. Whatever was out there was big, each footfall creating a vibration she could feel through the ground, and it seemed to be conducting a systematic survey of the area, pausing occasionally as if examining something of interest before continuing its circuit. Sarah's rational mind tried to catalog possibilities, a bear, an elk, maybe even another camper. But the pattern of movement was too methodical, too purposeful, and the weight suggested something far larger than any animal that was supposed to exist in these mountains. The footsteps completed their circuit of the clearing and then, impossibly, began moving directly toward Sarah's tent with the confidence of something that knew exactly where she was and had decided it was time for a closer inspection. Sarah's hand found her headlamp in the darkness, her fingers closing around it, but not yet turning it on. Some instinct warning her that revealing her awareness might trigger a response she wasn't prepared to handle. The footsteps stopped approximately 10 feet from her tent, and in the silence that followed, Sarah became aware of a new sound. Breathing, deep and rhythmic, the exhalations of something with a lung capacity far beyond human scale. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and Sarah had the terrifying realization that whatever was out there was standing completely still, simply listening to her the same way she was listening to it. Then came a sound that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life, a long, slow inhalation as if the creature was drawing in her scent, analyzing her presence through smell in a way that felt violently intimate and invasive. The breathing moved closer, and Sarah realized with mounting horror that the creature had dropped to a crouch and was now positioned directly outside her tent wall, separated from her by nothing but a thin layer of nylon that suddenly seemed as insubstantial as tissue paper. She could hear it shifting its weight, could hear what sounded like hands or paws pressing against the ground, could hear the soft rustle of movement that suggested it was leaning in even closer. The tent wall near her head began to bow inward slightly, pressed by something on the other side, and Sarah had to bite down on her sleeping bag to keep from screaming. The creature remained in that position for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally shifting its weight or adjusting its position, but never moving away from the tent, never giving Sarah any indication of what it wanted or what it planned to do next. She could smell it now, a musky, earthy odor that was somehow both animal and not animal, mixed with something that reminded her of wet stone and decaying leaves. The scent was so strong it made her eyes water, and she had to breathe through her mouth to keep from gagging, terrified that any sound she made might trigger an attack or provoke the creature into more aggressive action. Her mind raced through everything she'd learned about wildlife encounters. Make yourself big, make noise, never run. But all of that advice seemed laughably inadequate for whatever was crouched outside her tent in the darkness. At 2:47 a.m., Sarah heard a sound that stopped her heart, the metallic whisper of her tent zipper being slowly, deliberately pulled open from the outside. The movement was controlled and precise, nothing like the random pawing of an animal trying to get at food, and Sarah watched in frozen terror as the zipper traveled down its track with the steady progress of something that understood exactly how the mechanism worked. The creature was opening her tent with the casual competence of someone who had done this before, who knew what zippers were and how they functioned, and that realization was somehow more terrifying than anything else that had happened. Sarah's hand tightened on her headlamp, her thumb finding the power button, her entire body tensed for whatever was about to happen next. The zipper reached the bottom of its track, and the tent flap fell open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical substance, a void that swallowed her headlamp beam before it could illuminate anything useful. Sarah could see a shape in that darkness, a massive silhouette that blocked out the stars, and she could feel hot breath washing over her face in rhythmic waves that smelled of earth and something else she couldn't identify. The creature made a soft sound, almost questioning, and Sarah realized with a jolt of primal terror that it was trying to communicate with her, trying to elicit some kind of response that would help it understand what she was. Her finger pressed the headlamp button before her conscious mind could stop her, and the sudden flood of light revealed something that her brain struggled to process or accept as real. The creature crouched at her tent entrance stood at least 7 feet tall, even in its hunched position, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with a face that was simultaneously human and utterly alien. Its eyes caught her headlamp beam and reflected it back with an amber glow that spoke of intelligence and awareness, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. The being's hand, and it was definitely a hand, not a paw, rested on the tent frame with fingers that were too long and too thick to be human but showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and the capacity for fine motor control. For 3 heartbeats, Sarah and the creature simply stared at each other, and in that moment of connection, she understood with absolute certainty that this was no animal, no bear or elk, or any other creature that science had cataloged and explained. The creature's reaction to the light was not what Sarah expected. Instead of retreating or attacking, it simply tilted its head in what appeared to be curiosity, studying her face with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that were more human than animal, and it made another soft vocalization that carried tones of what might have been inquiry or greeting. Sarah's terror began to mix with a strange sense of wonder as she realized that the creature wasn't behaving aggressively, wasn't showing any signs of wanting to harm her, but rather seemed genuinely curious about her presence in its territory. The being's eyes moved from her face to her sleeping bag to the interior of her tent, taking in details with obvious intelligence. And Sarah had the bizarre thought that she was being evaluated, assessed according to criteria she couldn't begin to understand. The moment of connection was shattered when Sarah's headlamp began to flicker and dim, the batteries draining at an impossible rate, as if something was actively interfering with the electrical current. The creature's eyes widened slightly at the changing light, and it made a sound that might have been surprise or concern, leaning back from the tent entrance as if giving her space. In the failing light, Sarah caught glimpses of other shapes moving at the edge of the clearing, more massive silhouettes that suggested the creature at her tent wasn't alone, that she was surrounded by multiple beings that had been watching her sleep. The headlamp died completely, plunging everything back into darkness, and Sarah heard the creature at her tent make a series of soft vocalizations that were answered by the others in what sounded unmistakably like conversation. In the darkness, Sarah's other senses became hyper-aware, cataloging details that her panicked mind struggled to process into any coherent understanding. She could hear the creatures moving around the clearing with surprising stealth for beings of their size, could hear what sounded like objects being moved or examined, could hear vocalizations that carried back and forth in patterns that suggested complex communication. The being at her tent entrance remained in position, and Sarah could feel its presence like a physical weight, could sense it watching her, even though she could no longer see its eyes. Minutes passed in this strange standoff, with Sarah too terrified to move, and the creature apparently content to simply observe. And she began to wonder if this was how she would die, not torn apart by a monster, but simply studied to death by something that viewed her as an interesting specimen. Then, without warning, the creature at her tent made a sound that was unmistakably a sigh, a very human gesture of what might have been disappointment or resignation. And Sarah heard it begin to move away from the tent entrance. The zipper was pulled closed from the outside with the same careful precision it had been opened, and the footsteps retreated back toward the tree line, accompanied by the sounds of the other creatures also withdrawing from the clearing. Within minutes, the forest had returned to that oppressive silence, and Sarah was left alone in her tent, shaking uncontrollably and wondering if what had just happened was real or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the musky smell remained, and the tent zipper was definitely closed in a way she hadn't left it, and her headlamp batteries were completely drained despite being fresh when she'd started the trip. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of that night, lying rigid in her sleeping bag with her backup flashlight clutched in her hand, listening for any indication that the creatures might return. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, she worked up the courage to unzip her tent and look outside, half expecting to find no evidence of the night's encounter, some proof that her exhausted mind had invented the entire experience. What she found instead was a clearing that had been transformed overnight, marked with evidence that couldn't be explained away or rationalized as imagination. Massive footprints circled her tent in perfect spirals, each print measuring at least 18 inches in length and pressed deep into the earth with a weight that suggested something far heavier than any known animal. The footprints weren't the only evidence left behind. Sarah's camping equipment had been moved and rearranged, items taken from her pack and placed in careful arrangements that suggested examination rather than random disturbance. Her food bag, which she'd hung from a tree branch the previous evening, had been lowered to the ground and opened, the contents removed and sorted into groups that seemed to be organized by type or smell. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be gifts left near her tent entrance. Smooth river stones arranged in geometric patterns, and a collection of unusual feathers that didn't match any bird species Sarah could identify. The message was clear. The creatures had spent hours examining her belongings while she cowered in her tent, studying her supplies with obvious intelligence and leaving behind evidence of their visit that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Sarah's hand shook as she pulled out her phone to document the evidence, only to find that the device was completely dead, despite having been fully charged the previous day. Her camera equipment was similarly drained, every battery depleted, as if something had drawn the power from them during the night, and her backup power bank showed zero charge, despite being new and unused. The systematic failure of all her electronic devices felt deliberate, as if the creatures possessed some ability to interfere with technology or had actively worked to prevent her from documenting their presence. She was left with only her own memory and the physical evidence in the clearing, proof that something impossible had happened, but no way to capture it in a format that anyone else would believe. The decision to leave came quickly. Sarah began breaking down her camp with trembling hands, desperate to put distance between herself and the clearing before nightfall brought another encounter she might not survive. As she worked, she became aware of sounds in the forest around her, subtle indications that she was still being watched by the creatures that had visited her tent. Branches moved without wind, shadows shifted in ways that suggested massive forms moving just out of sight, and occasionally she would catch glimpses of amber eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. The beings seemed content to observe her departure without interfering, but their presence was a constant pressure that made every movement feel like it was being evaluated and judged. Sarah's hike back to her car became a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion, with every sound making her jump and every shadow seeming to hide something massive and aware. The trail that had been difficult to follow on her way in now seemed deliberately obscured, with landmarks she remembered appearing in wrong locations and paths that led in circles despite her compass readings. She had the growing certainty that she was being herded again, guided along specific routes by an intelligence that remained hidden but was clearly controlling her movement through the forest. The 4-hour hike stretched into 7 hours of stumbling through undergrowth and backtracking from dead ends, and Sarah began to wonder if she would ever be allowed to leave, if the creatures had decided to keep her in their territory for reasons she couldn't comprehend. When Sarah finally reached her car in the late afternoon, she found it exactly as she'd left it, but with one disturbing addition: massive handprints in the dust on her windows, prints that showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and fingers that were far too large to be human. The creatures had found her vehicle and examined it, leaving their marks as a message, or perhaps a warning. And Sarah realized that they had known where her car was parked all along, had probably watched her arrive and followed her to the clearing. The implications were terrifying. These beings understood human technology, understood vehicles and equipment, and had been tracking her movements from the moment she entered their territory. She wasn't dealing with simple animals, but with an intelligence that had been observing humans for long enough to understand their patterns and behaviors. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of that night, lying rigid in her sleeping bag with her backup flashlight clutched in her hand, listening for any indication that the creatures might return. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, she worked up the courage to unzip her tent and look outside, half expecting to find no evidence of the night's encounter. What she found instead was a clearing that had been transformed overnight. Massive footprints circled her tent in perfect spirals, each print measuring at least 18 inches in length and pressed deep into the earth with a weight that suggested something far heavier than any known animal. Sarah's camping equipment had been moved and rearranged, items taken from her pack and placed in careful arrangements that suggested examination rather than random disturbance. Her food bag had been lowered to the ground and opened, the contents sorted into groups organized by type or smell. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be gifts left near her tent entrance. Smooth river stones arranged in geometric patterns and a collection of unusual feathers that didn't match any bird species Sarah could identify. The creatures had spent hours examining her belongings while she cowered in her tent. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone to document the evidence, only to find that the device was completely dead despite having been fully charged the previous day. Her camera equipment was similarly drained, every battery depleted, as if something had drawn the power from them during the night. The systematic failure of all her electronic devices felt deliberate, as if the creatures possessed some ability to interfere with technology. The decision to leave came quickly. Sarah began breaking down her camp with trembling hands, desperate to put distance between herself and the clearing before nightfall brought another encounter. As she worked, she became aware of sounds in the forest around her. Branches moved without wind, shadows shifted in ways that suggested massive forms moving just out of sight, and occasionally she would catch glimpses of amber eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. But as Sarah pulled up the last tent stake, something happened that made her freeze completely. From the tree line directly in front of her, one of the creatures stepped partially into view, not fully revealing itself, but allowing her to see more than she had in the darkness. In the morning light, she could make out details that her headlamp had missed. The creature's face showed expressions that were disturbingly human, its eyes tracking her movements with an intelligence that made her feel like she was being studied. It raised one massive hand and pointed deliberately toward the trail that led out of the clearing, then back at her, then toward the trail again. The message was unmistakable. It was time for her to leave. Sarah nodded slowly and began gathering her scattered equipment, noticing that other creatures had emerged from the forest at different points around the clearing, forming a loose circle that surrounded her position but maintained a calculated distance. They were all watching her with that same focused attention, and Sarah had the disturbing realization that her entire departure was being orchestrated. One of the beings made a soft vocalization, and the others responded in what sounded like agreement. As Sarah shouldered her pack and took her first steps toward the trail, the creature that had pointed the way made another sound, this one longer and more complex, with tonal variations that almost sounded like speech. It repeated the vocalization, accompanied by a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire clearing, then a motion toward Sarah herself, then a sweeping gesture toward the forest beyond. The creature appeared to be explaining something, perhaps warning her, or maybe inviting her to understand something about the relationship between its kind and this place. Sarah's hike back to her car became a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion, with every sound making her jump and every shadow seeming to hide something massive and aware. The trail seemed deliberately obscured, with landmarks appearing in wrong locations and paths that led in circles. She had the growing certainty that she was being herded again, but this time the herding felt different, not threatening, but almost protective, as if the creatures were ensuring she stayed on safe paths. Several times she heard movement paralleling her path, and once she caught a clear glimpse of one of the massive figures keeping pace with her through the trees. The 4-hour hike stretched into 7 hours of stumbling through undergrowth and backtracking from dead ends. But then, as exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her fear, the forest suddenly opened up and she found herself on a familiar section of trail. Despite all the confusion, she'd been guided to within a mile of where she'd parked her car. The creatures had been leading her out rather than trapping her in. When Sarah finally reached her car in the late afternoon, she found it exactly as she'd left it, but with one disturbing addition: massive handprints in the dust on her windows, prints that showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and fingers that were far too large to be human. The creatures had found her vehicle and examined it, and Sarah realized that they had known where her car was parked all along, had probably watched her arrive, and followed her to the clearing. As Sarah sat in her car, hands still shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition, she noticed one final detail that made her blood run cold. Arranged on her hood in a careful pattern were more of those smooth river stones, positioned in the same geometric arrangement she'd seen near her tent, and tucked beneath the windshield wiper was a single unusual feather. The creatures had left her a parting gift, demonstrating that they could reach her possessions whenever they chose. Sarah started her car and drove away from the forest, watching in her rearview mirror as the trees seemed to close behind her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that amber eyes were watching her departure, that somewhere in those woods, intelligent beings were discussing what they'd learned from their night of studying the human who'd been brave or foolish enough to sleep in their territory. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.